But the one great shocking occasion, when tens or hundreds or thousands will join you, never comes. That's the difficulty. If the last and the worst act of the whole regime had come immediately after the first and the smallest, thousands, yes, millions would have been sufficiently shocked. But of course, this isn't the way it happens. In between come all the hundreds of little steps, some of them imperceptible, each of them preparing you not to be shocked by the next. To live in this process is absolutely not to be able to notice it. Please try to believe me. Unless one has a much greater degree of political awareness, acuity, than most of us had ever had occasion to develop. Each step was so small, so inconsequential, so well explained, or on occasion regretted, that unless one were detached from the whole process from the beginning, unless one understood what the whole thing was in principle, what all these little measures that no patriotic German could resent must someday lead to, one no more saw it developing from day to day than a farmer in his field sees the corn growing. One day it is over his head. What then? You must shoot yourself. A few did. Or adjust your principles. Many tried, and some, I suppose, succeeded. Not I, however. Or learn to live the rest of your life with your shame. This last is the nearest there is, under the circumstances, to heroism. Shame. Many Germans became this poor kind of hero. Many more, I think, than the world knows or cares to know. It's very hard for me to talk about the Holocaust. Members of my immediate family and close friends are the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And so it's a very fresh wound and very fresh trauma. But that said, I'm going to try to address this topic. They Thought They Were Free by Milton Mayer is a book about the experience of regular Germans living in Germany from the years 1933 to 1945. In the 10 years after World War II, Milton Mayer, who's an American journalist, went to live in Germany and got to know the German people. And he specifically became very close with 10 individuals. All of these 10 people were members of the Nazi Party. And part of the shocking and unsettling revelation at the center of this book is that the author, Milton Mayer, became friends with these 10 Nazis. Quote, I found and find it hard to judge my Nazi friends, but I confess that I would rather judge them than myself. In my own case, I am always aware of the provocations and handicaps that excuse or at least explain my own bad acts. I am always aware of my good intentions, my good reasons for doing bad things. I should not like to die tonight, because some of the things that I had to do today, things that look very bad for me, I had to do in order to do something very good tomorrow that would more than compensate for today's bad behavior. But my Nazi friends did die tonight. The book of their Nazi lives is closed, without their having been able to do the good they may or may not have meant to do, the good that might have wiped out the bad they did. By easy extension, I would rather judge Germans than Americans. Now I see a little better how Nazism overcame Germany, not by attack from without or by subversion from within, but with a whoop and a holler. It was what most Germans wanted, or under pressure of combined reality and illusion came to want. They wanted it, they got it, and they liked it. Of course, the implication here is quite terrifying. If Nazis are just regular people, what does that say about regular people? What does that say about us? And this, of course, is something that Milton Mayer spells out explicitly. Quote, I came back home a little afraid for my country, afraid of what it might want and get and like, under pressure of combined reality and illusion. I felt and feel that it was not German man that I met, but man. He happened to be in Germany under certain conditions. He might be here under certain conditions. He might, under certain conditions, be I. One of the main questions that I'm constantly asking when reading this book is, what is this confluence of reality and illusion that drove these people to become Nazis? What are the factors that facilitated or made possible the rise of fascism in Germany? And I think it's possible to identify a few different themes that emerge consistently throughout the book. And I'm not going to spell out any analogies between the themes as they arise in the book and current modern day politics in the Trump era. I think that I could see some analogies. If you can, that's great. If not, then that's okay too. That's also good. And so I'm just going to quickly read through a few quotes that sort of resonate with me and leave it at that. Quote, Nazism, as it proceeded from practice to theory, had to deny expertness in thinking, and then, the second process was never completed, in order to fill the vacuum, had to establish expert thinking of its own. That is, to find men of inferior or irresponsible caliber whose views conformed dishonestly, or worse yet, honestly, to the party line. As the Nazi emphasis on non-intellectual virtues, patriotism, loyalty, duty, purity, labor, simplicity, blood, folkishness, seeped through Germany, elevating the self-esteem of the little man, the academic profession was pushed from the very center to the periphery of society. By 1933, at least 5 of my 10 friends, and I think 6 or 7, looked upon intellectuals as unreliable, and among these unreliables, upon the academics as the most insidiously situated. Quote, my 10 friends had been told, not since 1939, but since 1933, that their nation was fighting for its life. They believed that self-preservation is the first law of nature. End quote. Elsewhere in the book, this is summarized as follows. Quote, neither morality nor religion, but legality is decisive in a state of perpetual siege. Once the war began, my colleague continued, resistance, protest, criticism, complaint all carried with them a multiplied likelihood of the greatest punishment. Mere lack of enthusiasm or failure to show it in public was defeatism. Once the war began, the government could do anything necessary to win it. So it was with the final solution of the Jewish problem, which the Nazis always talked about but never dared undertake, not even the Nazis, until war and its necessities gave them the knowledge that they could get away with it. End quote. Quote, having fixed our faith in a father figure, or in a father, or in a mother, or in a wife, we must keep it fixed until inexcusable fault, and what fault of a father, a mother, a wife is inexcusable, crushes it at once and completely. This figure represents our own best selves. It is what we ourselves want to be, and through identification are. To abandon it for anything less than crushing evidence of inexcusable fault is self-incrimination. Thus, Hitler was betrayed by his subordinates, and the little Nazis with him. They may hate Bormann or Goebbels, Bormann because he rose to power at the end, and they are ashamed of the end. Goebbels, because he was a runt with a, quote, Jewish mind, that is, a facile and cunning mind, unlike theirs. They may hate Himmler, and Blüthund, above all, because he killed in cold blood, and they wouldn't do that. But they may not hate Hitler or themselves. You see, said Taylor Schwenke, the littlest of my 10 little men, there was always a secret war against Hitler in the regime. They fought him with unfair means. Himmler I detested, Goebbels too. If Hitler had been told the truth, things would have been different for Hitler. Read I. And I'll just interject here that this secret war against Hitler reminds me of the swamp in the American political discourse surrounding Donald Trump. The role that the polarized political system played in Germany is really interesting to me. Throughout this whole book is this question: how could these 10 people have done this? How could they have supported the Nazi regime? And part of the answer that we get is that it's not just about who you support, it's also about who are you afraid of? What politics do you dismiss as being unacceptable? I think very often it's relatively easy to see propaganda when it's supporting a political ideology, when it's supporting a candidate, and to say this is clearly just rhetoric. But it could be harder sometimes to identify and to recognize propaganda when that propaganda is about dismissing or criticizing a different political program. And of course, in real life, political decisions can be very tricky. And it can require a lot of nuance and subtlety to compare to political programs that in your mind might not be ideal in either iteration. Quote, Hitlerism had to answer communism with something just as radical. Communism always used force. Hitlerism answered it with force. The real absolute enemy of communism, always clear, always strong in the popular mind, was National Socialism. The only enemy that answered communism in kind. If you wanted to save Germany from communism, to be sure of doing it, you went to National Socialism. The Nazi slogan in 1932 was, if you want your country to go Bolshevik, vote communist. If you want to remain free Germans, vote Nazi. I'd like to ask the American burgher, the middle-class man, what would you have done when your country stood so, a dictatorship or destruction by Bolshevism? Bolshevism looked like slavery and the death of the soul. It didn't matter if you were in agreement with Nazism. Nazism looked like the only defense. There was your choice. End quote. On whether or not Nazis, regular Nazis, knew about the gassing of the Jews. Quote, rumors, guesses, enough to make a man know if he wanted badly to know, or at least to believe, and always involving persons who would be suspected, naturally, of exaggerating. Goebbels' immediate subordinate, in charge of radio in the propaganda ministry, testified at Nuremberg that he had heard of the gassing of the Jews and went to Goebbels with the report. Goebbels said it was false. Enemy propaganda. And that was the end of it. The Nuremberg tribunal accepted this man's testimony on this point and acquitted him. In the American political discourse today, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of focus on questions of racism and questions of hate. People like to debate, is Donald Trump a racist? Are Trump supporters, are they racist? Is Stephen Miller a racist? Are hate crimes on the rise in America? Why are they on the rise in America? But for me, I think the most chilling lesson of this book, they thought they were free, is that this question of explicit racism, explicit hate, is in some ways less important than we might think. I think a central lesson of this book is that hatred and oppression are two different things. And it's possible to be oppressed by people who don't hate you. And it's possible to oppress people that you don't really hate. In life, I've often met people who are full of love and full of empathy. And they're wonderful people. They're really wonderful people. But they have terrible, terrible politics. And you can easily imagine people in the opposite category who have great politics but are very, very unpleasant people. And those two things can coexist. And they do coexist. It's hard to know how to think about these people sometimes, how to relate to them. It's very confusing, but that's the way politics works. Another message in this book that I think is really important. I think in America, me personally, I think a lot of people have a tendency to think that democracy is just stable, that democracies just work. If you have it, it's going to last. What this book says is that democracy is incredibly precarious. It's incredibly delicate. It's so easy to lose it. This is a quote I think about a lot when I worry about the future of the politics in my country. Quote, German music and art, German belles lettres and philosophy, German science and technology, German theology and education, especially at the highest levels, were part and parcel of Western achievement. German honesty, industry, family virtue, and civic government were the pride of other Western countries where Germans settled. I think, says Professor Karl Hermann, who never left his homeland, that even now the outside world does not realize how surprised we non-Nazis were in 1933. When mass dictatorship occurred in Russia and then in Italy, we said to one another, that is what happens in backward countries. We are fortunate for all our troubles that it cannot happen here. But it did. Worse even than elsewhere. And I think that all the explanations leave some mystery. When I think of it all, I still say with unbelief, Germany. No, not Germany. End quote. I feel like I could end this video here, but there's just one more quote that I want to read. When I do these videos, I try not to be personal. That's not my style. But I'm going to make a personal comment now. In my own life, I was raised in a milieu which is right-wing Zionist. And I've lived in the area, and I've been with people, and I've met people who are really on the front lines of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I've met wonderful people within the world of right-wing religious Zionism. People who are just so gracious and so hospitable and courageous and impressive in many ways. But politically, ideologically, I've left that world. I no longer feel comfortable there, to say the least. And the following quote captures why. It captures, I think, very beautifully the reason I've made that change. In this quote, there's a reference to a verse in the New Testament, the book of Matthew. Jesus says, quote, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." End quote. And of course, the idea being that Jesus values what's done for the least of them, the least of these, the weakest members of society. One of Milton Mayer's Nazi friends is addressing him. Quote, "You know, Herr Professor, we are told that not a sparrow falls without God's care. I am not being light when I say this, that not a person fell ill, or in need, or lost his job or his house without the parties caring. No organization has ever done this before in Germany, maybe nowhere else. Believe me, such an organization is irresistible to men. No one in Germany was alone in his troubles." And now the author interjects. "Except," I said, "inferior races and opponents of the regime." "Of course," he said, "that is understood. But they were few. They were outside society, over the fence, and nobody thought about them. But these too were sparrows. Yes, he said. Could these, I said, have been the least of them of whom Jesus spoke? Herr Professor, we didn't see it that way. We were sinful. We were wrong. But we didn't see it that way. We saw the least of them among our own people, everywhere, among ordinary people who obeyed the laws and were not Jews or gypsies and so on. Among ordinary people, Aryans, there were the least of them too, millions, 6 million unemployed at the beginning. These least, not all who were least, but most of them, had somewhere to turn at last. For me, this is the most terrible and the most critical question. Who are the least of them? It's so easy to get this question wrong. But everything hinges on this question. And everything is at stake.